195 meters of standing steel folded at a small number of calculated points and hit the ground in under a minute. 67 meters of height, close to 7,400 tons, gone that fast. That was 3 in the afternoon, the 22nd of May, 2026, on the eastern edge of Germany's Hambach mine. Cutting charges wired around a machine that had stood on that ground since 1962 had gone off within a fraction of a second of each other. Bagger 260, the excavator RWE had run for 63 years, was on the ground. Here's what the footage doesn't tell you. The explosion didn't finish the job. It barely started it. RWE's own account of that afternoon says the charges brought the standing structure down, nothing more. Everything after the collapse, the actual work of making the machine disappear, still had to happen by hand, with cutting torches and hydraulic shears over the months that followed. And 22 years before anyone lit a fuse, RWE faced the opposite problem with this exact machine. In 2004, the company spent €7 million making sure a moment like this never came. So what changed? That's the real question sitting underneath the footage. Not whether a demolition crew could bring down something this size. Plenty of firms can do that on request. The question is why a company that once paid a fortune to keep Bagger 260 in one piece would, decades later, choose to take it apart the most violent way available. And there's a second question right behind the first, one the headline never answers. If 90 seconds of explosives only put 16 million pounds of machinery on the ground, what does it actually take to make that much steel disappear? Both questions start in the same place, not with dynamite, with a decision RWE made about a machine most people outside the mining world had never heard of. A decision that took 2 years to arrive on paper and about a minute to carry out in steel. Before this is over, that decision runs through a closed federal motorway, a fleet of machines nobody outside this industry tracks, and an engineering trick for making 7,000 tons of standing steel fall exactly where you tell it to. Rewind 5 months. At the very end of January 2026, a crew walked out to Bagger 260 with tools instead of a shift plan for moving earth. RWE's own account is plain about the reason. The excavator was no longer needed, effective from the 1st of that year. There's no accident behind that sentence, and no breakdown either, just a machine that had, after 63 years, finally run out of a reason to keep turning. What followed wasn't a demolition yet, it was a slow undressing. Motors, cabling, anything with a second life left in it came out first, over the following months, while the bare steel skeleton stayed rooted to the same patch of ground it had worked for years. By May, what was left standing was closer to a stripped hull than a working excavator. That timeline raises the first real puzzle. If crews are already walking through the machine with wrenches for 4 months, and the plan all along is to cut the wreckage apart piece by piece once it's down anyway, why reach for explosives at all? Why not just keep sending the same crews back with the same wrenches until nothing is left standing? The honest answer is a question of shape, not spectacle. A structure like this doesn't want to fall over. It's built from the same kind of welded steel lattice that holds up a bridge or a transmission tower, strong precisely because its load is spread across dozens of connected members, which is also exactly what makes it stubborn to take apart from the top. Taking it apart from the top down means putting a crew at height for months on a frame designed to carry a bucket wheel and a boom, not to be climbed and cut section by hand. A controlled collapse solves that problem once, in under a minute from a safe distance, and hands the actual cutting crews a pile they can reach from the ground instead of a tower they'd have to climb. That explains the method. It doesn't explain the decision underneath it. RWE didn't run out of ways to keep Bagger 260 standing. 22 years earlier, the company proved exactly the opposite. It went to remarkable lengths to keep this same machine intact and running. That means the real story doesn't start in May of 2026. It starts on a closed motorway, with the same excavator crawling toward a very different ending. In the early summer of 2004, Bagger 260 had just finished its work at the Garzweiler mine. Its next job was waiting 29 kilometers away, at Hambach. The obvious way to get it there was to take it apart, truck the pieces across, and rebuild it on arrival. RWE looked at that option and rejected it. By the company's own accounting at the time, dismantling and reassembling a machine worth roughly 40 million euros would have cost substantially more than moving it whole, and taken considerably longer besides. So instead, over the better part of a month, Bagger 260 walked. It left Garzweiler on the 14th of June, crossing the L213 road in the early morning, in what crews on site were calling a meeting of giants: 2 belt wagons, an excavator, and 2 spreaders, all converging on the same narrow stretch within hours of each other, trailed by a convoy of support vehicles. Picture the scene at first light. Enormous machines queued along a country road at a walking pace, engineers and safety crews threading between them, the whole procession looking less like a construction operation than a small industrial parade, except that every vehicle in it was too large to be moved any other way. 4 days later, on the 18th, it crossed the L361N and the river Erft itself. The water routed underneath the machine's path through a crossing built and cleared inside a single working day. Bagger 260 wasn't the only large machine on the move that month either. While it worked its way toward Hambach, a spreader named Absetzer 755 was traveling the opposite direction on a parallel schedule, out of the Bergheim mine and into the space at Garzweiler that Bagger 260's own departure had just freed up. For a company running 3 mines at once, this wasn't one isolated spectacle. It was a single visible link in a longer chain of relocations, each one timed to open the ground the next machine needed. The A61 crossing just happened to be the one moment that chain became public, instead of an internal logistics problem nobody outside the company ever saw. The last obstacle was the biggest one. On the evening of Saturday the 26th of June, the A61, a functioning federal motorway, closed to traffic. Crews pulled the guardrails, then spread sand across the asphalt to keep 12 crawler tracks worth of steel from tearing up the road surface underneath. The belt wagon crossed first, a little after 9 at night. The country's technical relief service lit the route with light balloons once the sun was down. 2 hours later, the whole convoy, excavator, spreaders, support vehicles, had crossed. Crews cleared the sand behind them, and the motorway reopened to ordinary traffic on schedule the next afternoon, having been closed for the better part of 19 hours. This wasn't a quiet operation. Thousands of people came out to watch. Some bussed in for free from parking areas RWE had set up for the occasion. Some walking out along temporary footbridges built specifically so spectators could stand at a safe distance from the crossing point. They came to see well over 10,000 tons of mining equipment cross a national highway after dark, moving at a pace slower than most of them could comfortably walk. It was, by any measure, a production, the kind of logistical spectacle a company puts on when it wants a machine seen arriving, not quietly written off. Years later, when the state rebuilt that stretch of the A61 with permanent concrete median barriers, RWE had special steel structures built into the crossing point specifically so a future excavator could still make the same trip if it ever needed to. Nobody in 2004 was planning for this machine to disappear. They were building infrastructure on the assumption it might need to cross that motorway again. The whole operation, start to finish, cost roughly 7 million euros. Set that beside the estimate for taking the machine apart and rebuilding it at the other end, and RWE's arithmetic becomes obvious. Whole and moving, even at a few meters a minute, even with a motorway shut down for the night, was still the cheaper option. Disassembly wasn't just unnecessary in 2004. By RWE's own numbers, it was the expensive path. 22 years later, disassembly is exactly where the story ends. Somewhere between that closed motorway and that afternoon in May, the arithmetic flipped. What Bagger 260 spent those decades doing explains the shift, because this was never a machine that struggled to find work. It went into service on the 25th of October 1962, assembled on site at what was then the Fortuna mine, west of Cologne. A Krupp-built machine, one of 4 sister excavators raised in that same class there across roughly a decade. Within 2 months it was already opening new ground on a different level of the pit. 2 years after that, a different level again. By 1975, it was cutting a 5th level down to 130 meters below sea level, a job that took the better part of a year on its own. The same wheel, the same 12 tracks, turned toward whichever wall of earth needed cutting once the last one ran dry. That pattern, one level exhausted, the machine reassigned to the next, held for 2 decades until Fortuna itself ran out of coal to give it. In 1985, the excavator moved to the Bergheim mine and stayed 12 years. In 1999, it moved again to Garsweiler. 5 years after that came the walk to Hambach. Say the obvious part plainly: 4 mines, 6.5 decades, and every single time the ground under it ran out, somebody found the next patch of ground that needed exactly what it did. That is the pattern the 2026 ending breaks. At Hambach, Bagger 260 settled into a role at the eastern end of the mine's first working level outside the boundary of the Hambach forest, the stretch of old-growth woodland that had become the flashpoint of Germany's coal politics for the better part of a decade. When a line got drawn in front of that forest saying the digging stops here, the first level's westward reach ended there. What was left to mine sat to the east, in a strip the excavator was already sized to handle. A sister machine, Bagger 259, had worked that same level until the line was drawn in 2019. Once its share of the work ran out, RWE brought it down that October, a little over 44 kilograms of charge, cutting through pylons, booms, and steel cable at 264 separate points, a 70-meter structure reduced to 7,000 tons of scrap in a single afternoon. Bagger 260 kept working the eastern strip of the same level straight through that, and for years afterward, the 2 machines' territory divided between them until only one of the 2 was still standing. That was its first close look at how this particular story ends, 6 years before its own turn came. For a while, the eastern strip was enough on its own. 4 to 5 men ran the excavator across a shift, pulling forest gravel and mixed soil off that level day after day, the same routine repeating itself as it had at 3 mines before this one, the wheel turning, the belts running, the loading arm swinging the same arc it had swung for 6 decades, in weather that didn't care how old the machine underneath it was. The public record doesn't name any of those operators, not for Bagger 260's final years, and not for the afternoon in May. That's not unusual. The people who keep a machine like this running for decades, and the crews who eventually take it apart, generally don't end up in an article about it. The machine gets the number, the nameplate, the 6 decades of service on record. The people do the work and go home. But mines shrink from every direction at once, and Hambach's own operating plans, the technical filings RWE submits to German mining regulators every few years, tell the rest of the story without needing a single quote from anyone. As of 2024, 7 bucket wheel excavators worked the pit. 6 of them belonged to 2 newer, larger classes, rated to move 200,000 or 240,000 cubic meters of ground or coal in a single day. Bagger 260 was the 7th. It belonged to the oldest and smallest class still running anywhere at Hambach, rated at 110,000, under half what its newest neighbor could move on the same shift. That same filing states the plan outright 2 years before anyone lit a fuse. Bagger 260's retirement was scheduled for 2026, and once it was gone, its stretch of the first level would be handed to a machine from the 240,000 class instead. A machine built to do more than double its daily work, taking over the same ground without missing a shift. This is the part the headline skips past entirely. Bagger 260 didn't fail, and it didn't run out of ground to mine. There was still material on that level worth moving. What ran out was the argument for keeping the smallest, oldest machine in the fleet on a job a bigger one could now finish faster. 63 years in, The excavator that had never once run out of a next assignment finally did. Knowing all that, the next question is the one anybody who watched Bagger 260 cross a national motorway in 2004 would ask first. They moved it before. Why not just move it again? Start with the option that has precedent on its side. The excavator could, in principle, still walk. The same 12 tracks, the same few meters a minute, the same kind of prepared corridor RWE built in 2004. What 2004 doesn't answer is where it would walk to. Every other bucket wheel excavator left at Hambach already belongs to a bigger class, doing a bigger job. Garzweiler, the mine that sent Bagger 260 to Hambach in the first place, is running down its own clock under the same coal phase-out rules, its own workable ground shrinking on the same regulatory calendar. RWE's own planning filings for Hambach describe a mine that, through the back half of this decade, has barely 270 hectares of new ground left to take at all. A sliver of what this same operation covered when Bagger 260 first arrived in 2004. Nothing in the public record shows a third mine waiting with an opening for a machine rated at 110,000 cubic meters a day, because there was, by then, barely enough open ground left for the machines already standing on it. Moving it again solves nothing if there's nowhere left that wants what it does. Selling it is the option that sounds obvious and turns out to be nearly meaningless once you understand what a machine like this is, economically speaking. A 110,000 class bucket wheel excavator isn't manufactured, sold, and installed the way an ordinary piece of construction equipment is. It's assembled on site, over months, around the specific geometry of the pit it's built to work, the width of the levels, the composition of the ground, the layout of the belt system it has to feed. Move it to a mine with a different pit shape or a different material mix, and much of what made it efficient at Hambach stops applying. RWE has in the past offered smaller retired excavators for public auction. A Krupp-built machine from 1959 went up for sale through a Hamburg auction house in 2020. Buyer collects on site. But that unit was scrap-bound curiosity for whoever wanted it, not a working production asset, and nothing in the public record suggests RWE ever ran a comparable sale process for Bagger 260. There's no showroom for a machine like this, and no listing. A buyer wanting exactly this footprint, exactly this capacity, delivered exactly here, essentially doesn't exist. The market for a 110,000 class excavator on the far end of its working life is just the market for scrap steel wearing a machine's shape. Preservation is the option every viewer thinks of before the other three. Turn it into a monument, the way a handful of retired industrial machines around the world have become roadside attractions. It's also the option with no paper trail here at all. No heritage proposal on record, no preservation campaign, and the practical case against it holds up even without one. A 195-meter steel structure needs land, upkeep, and open-ended liability coverage at a site whose entire future footprint is a lake, not a park. RWE's work at Hambach right now is filling in a pit, not building monuments. That leaves the fourth option, the one that actually happened. By the time it did, Bagger 260 wasn't even the last piece of its own traveling party still standing. Absetzer 744, the spreader that crossed the A61 alongside it back in 2004, came down at Hambach in August of 2025, 9 months before Bagger 260's own turn. 27 kilograms of explosive at 300 separate points, the whole structure gone in a matter of seconds. The blastmaster on that job, Michael Schneider, working with a colleague named Artur Feitenheimer, described the result afterward about as plainly as it looked on camera. Every section had landed exactly where the calculations said it would, the operation running to plan from start to finish. A Hambach engineer overseeing machinery on site, Lars Freiboth, put the bigger picture in a single line at that same event. Every large machine still standing at the mine is on the same clock now, tied to the date the pit itself stops digging, and by then, all of it has to be gone. That's the real answer to why not move it again. It isn't that RWE couldn't have. The entire category Bagger 260 belonged to the company's own fleet of aging, undersized mining equipment was already being retired around it, on a published schedule, one machine at a time. Its own traveling partner from 2004 was gone before anyone lit a fuse under Bagger 260 itself. There was no herd left to rejoin, so RWE landed on the fourth option because the other three had already closed, for reasons that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with a fleet that had outgrown it. And once dismantling was the plan needed a starting point that had nothing to do with explosives at all. 4 months of crews going through the machine by hand, taking out everything worth a second life before the rest of it went down. Picture what that means on a machine this size. A bucket wheel excavator isn't one object. It's closer to a small factory built to move, motors driving the wheel itself, separate motors for the crawler tracks and the conveyor belts carrying material off the cutting head and out through the machine's spine, switchgear, control cabinets, kilometers of heavy cable, including the 1,200-meter cable drum that once kept the whole thing powered while it was underway. Very little of that is bespoke, one-off hardware. Most of it is the same class of equipment running on the 6 excavators staying at Hambach a while longer and on machinery elsewhere across RWE's wider fleet. RWE hasn't published an inventory of exactly what came off Bagger 260 before May. What the company has said is simpler and in its own way more telling. Reusable components were removed first, over the 4 months before the blast. That single sentence describes a real change in what the machine was, weeks before anyone touched it with explosives. A 110,000 class excavator, fully equipped, is worth keeping around, or at least worth the trouble of moving. The same excavator with its motors and cabling already stripped out is worth exactly one thing: the steel it's made of. That's the part of this story that never makes the highlight reel, because it isn't dramatic. Nobody films a technician disconnecting a switch cabinet, but it's the actual first act of the demolition, and it took months, not seconds. By the time a blast crew arrived to start drilling and wiring the structure for cutting charges, they weren't destroying a working machine anymore. They were clearing away what was left of one after everything with a second use had already gone out the gate in the back of a truck. RWE didn't stop needing 110,000 class components the day Bagger 260 stopped needing to be a 110,000 class excavator. The machine's working life ended in May. Pieces of it are almost certainly still turning somewhere in that fleet right now. Some of what came off it most likely didn't travel far at all. RWE runs 3 lignite mines in the same regional network, sharing spare parts, engineers, and maintenance crews across all of them the way any efficient operator would. A drive motor or a length of heavy cable pulled from a retired excavator at Hambach is exactly the kind of component that turns up months later, keeping a machine running at Garzweiler or Inden instead. Not as a headline anywhere, just as a line on a maintenance log, doing the same job it always did, under a different machine's number. What was left after 4 months of that wasn't a machine anymore, in any sense that matters. It was a hollowed steel skeleton, standing exactly where it had always stood, waiting for engineers to work out precisely where to cut it so that several thousand tons of it would fall the way they wanted, instead of the way gravity would choose on its own. That's the actual engineering problem, and it's worth sitting with, because it's more interesting than the explosion itself. Nobody was trying to blow up 7,400 tons of steel. That would take an enormous quantity of explosive, an enormous exclusion zone, and would scatter debris in every direction, the opposite of what a demolition inside a working mine, surrounded by conveyor systems and other active machinery, can afford. The actual goal runs almost the other way. Find the smallest possible number of places where cutting the steel makes the rest of the structure agree to fall on its own. Every standing structure this size holds itself up through a small number of load paths, the legs, joints, and connections doing the real work of carrying weight down to the ground, inside a structure that is otherwise mostly empty space and framework around them. Miss those points, and a charge can go off almost anywhere without much happening. Find them, And cutting a comparatively small amount of steel is enough to bring several thousand tons down, the same way removing the right 2 or 3 joints from a bridge collapses a span that 100 lesser cuts wouldn't touch. There's a reason RWE doesn't just send a crew up with cutting torches to work down a standing structure this tall piece by piece, the way some demolitions are handled. Every hour a person spends working at height on a partially cut structure is an hour spent trusting a calculation that hasn't been fully tested yet, removing support from underneath yourself while you're still standing on what's left of it. A synchronized blast takes that risk and compresses it, from months of exposure down to about a minute of it, and moves the people doing the most dangerous part of the job off the structure entirely, to a control point well outside the fall radius. It's a trade. Concentrate the danger into the shortest possible window in exchange for keeping nobody standing on a structure that is, for that 1 minute, the thing doing the failing. Picture standing at the base of 195 meters of steel, being told that the only thing separating you from several thousand tons of it choosing a direction to fall is whether an engineer, months earlier, correctly marked which handful of beams were actually doing the work of holding the rest of it up. That's not a demolition problem. That's a structural engineering problem wearing a demolition problem's clothes. Identifying those points isn't guesswork. It comes from the same structural drawings used to build the machine in the first place, run back through modern calculation to work out exactly which members carry load and which ones are just along for the ride, what engineers on jobs like this call the statically decisive points, the handful of locations where a single cut changes whether the whole structure stands or falls. Comparable demolitions on excavators of this general type, at this same mine, have used dozens to a few hundred separate cutting locations, ringed around the structure's legs, booms, and connecting joints, each charge-sized and timed to sever its own piece of steel within a fraction of a second of the others. WE hasn't published the exact charge count or explosive weight used specifically on Bagger 260, and that's worth being honest about rather than quietly borrowing a number from a different demolition at the same site. What is documented for this machine specifically is the method, cutting charges at statically decisive points, and the outcome, 195 meters of standing structure on the ground in under a minute. There's real discipline hiding inside that restraint. A charge that fires too early, ahead of its neighbors, can throw the whole sequence off. One leg gives way before the opposite side is ready to follow, and instead of a structure settling straight down onto itself, something twists, topples sideways, or lands somewhere it wasn't supposed to. A charge that fires too late does the same damage in reverse. The entire choreography depends on timing measured in fractions of a second across every cut point at once, which is why a job like this gets planned for months and executed in under 60 seconds. Nearly all of the actual work happens before anyone lights anything. Gravity does the actual work of bringing the structure down. The explosives never lift it, throw it, or blast it apart. Despite what the word suggests, their job is narrower and stranger than that. Remove the steel that's currently arguing against gravity, at the right places, in the right order, and several thousand tons does what it was always going to do the moment nothing was left holding it up. That same timing discipline is why so few of these operations go wrong, even though the physics involved would suggest otherwise. At this same mine, a year earlier, the demolition of Bagger 260's own former traveling companion used 27 kilograms of explosive spread across 300 separate points to bring down a smaller structure, and by the blast master's own account afterward, every piece of it landed exactly where the calculations said it would. That isn't luck. That's the entire point of doing the structural analysis first. By the time the countdown starts, there shouldn't be a single unknown left in the equation. None of that happens in isolation from the rest of the mine either. 6 other excavators were still working other levels of Hambach on the day this one came down. Conveyor systems threading between levels, a working rail line hauling coal off-site, roads carrying trucks and personnel through the pit around the clock. A charge that throws debris further than calculated, or a shock wave large enough to unsettle equipment on a neighboring level, isn't just a safety problem for the demolition crew. It's a problem for every other active worksite nearby. That's the quiet reason the exclusion zone gets checked and rechecked, rather than cordoned only around the footprint of the excavator itself. The radius has to account for a mine that keeps working right up until the moment the charges fire. Getting to that single afternoon also means clearing a stack of approvals that has nothing to do with engineering at all. Demolition by explosive inside an active mine in Germany means coordinating with the regional mining authority, with whatever emergency services might need to respond if something goes wrong, and with RWE's own internal safety process, the same layered sign-off that governs every blast the company runs at any of its sites. Every bit of that paperwork has to close out clean before the 60 seconds of footage can happen at all, and almost all of it is invisible in the footage itself. Clearing the area first accounts for one more thing. A fall this size produces its own shockwave and its own debris field, smaller than most people expect, but never zero. The crew that walked back out to the site once the dust settled wasn't checking whether the explosion had looked impressive. They were checking whether every one of those calculated cut points had done exactly what the math predicted, because if even one hadn't, the next job, clearing the wreckage, would start from a far more dangerous position than the one they'd planned for. By the third week of May, the stripped skeleton of Bagger 260 had been standing wired and untouched for weeks, waiting on a schedule that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with weather windows, safety clearances, and coordination with a mine that doesn't stop running just because one corner of it is about to come down. The worst of it, for anyone still watching the machine hoping for some last-minute reprieve, was still ahead, and it had a date, the 22nd of May. That morning arrived like any other working day at Hambach. 6 other excavators were still cutting overburden and coal on 6 other levels. Conveyor belts were still moving. The mine's own rail line was still hauling coal north to the power stations it had always fed. In the middle of all that ordinary motion, one corner of the site had been quietly cleared since morning. Access roads blocked. Personnel pulled back beyond the calculated safety distance. The exclusion zone checked and rechecked the way it is every time RWE does this at Hambach. At around 3 in the afternoon, the blast master gave the signal. The charges fired in their planned sequence, each one severing its assigned piece of steel within a fraction of a second of the ones around it. 195 meters of structure that had stood upright since 1962 folded at its calculated joints and came down onto the ground it had spent 6 decades mining. The sound reached the safety line before the dust did, a sharp compressed crack, then a longer grinding roar as steel gave way and settled into itself. Then, several seconds later, a slower cloud of dust and disturbed earth rolling out from where the structure had stood. From the first charge to the final settling dust, the whole thing was over in under a minute. What had been the tallest object on that stretch of the pit for longer than most of the people watching had been alive was, by 3:05, a field of collapsed steel lying roughly where the engineers had planned for it to land. There's a version of this moment built entirely for spectacle, footage clipped down to 15 seconds and shared without any of the context around it. And it's real. It is rare to watch something the size of a small office building come down in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. But the people who'd spent 4 months emptying the machine, and the engineers who'd spent longer than that calculating exactly where to cut it, weren't watching for spectacle. They were watching a hypothesis get tested, the same one that gets tested every time RWE does this at Hambach. Does several thousand tons of steel go down exactly where the structural drawings say it will, or does one of those statically decisive points turn out to be wrong in a way nobody caught in advance? It went down where they said it would. That sentence matters more than the collapse itself. A controlled demolition that behaves exactly as calculated isn't a spectacle succeeding. It's a structural analysis being proven correct. A far less cinematic way of describing the same 60 seconds, and the only version of it the engineers who did the work cared about. This is also where the story stops being simple. Everyone watching that footage, then and since, has made the same assumption. The excavator is down, so the excavator is gone. RWE's own account of that afternoon says otherwise, in one quiet sentence sitting well below the headline. The blast brought the structure to the ground. On its own, it finished nothing. What actually inverts the footage is everything that happens next. The explosion is the piece of this story that takes 90 seconds and gets filmed. What comes after is the piece that takes months and gets almost no attention, and it's the piece that actually finishes what the title promises. Once the blast crew has confirmed the site is safe, real dismantling starts, and it looks nothing like an explosion. It looks like ordinary, patient, heavy demolition work. Excavators fitted with hydraulic shears instead of buckets, working the collapsed steel apart piece by piece, cutting torches for the joints and sections too thick or too awkwardly positioned for shears alone. Mobile cranes lifting sections clear so crews underneath can keep working the next layer down. That process doesn't happen in under a minute. It happens over weeks, then months. The same field of collapsed structure getting smaller and more manageable one cut at a time, until what's left will fit on a truck. When Bagger 259 came down in 2020, RWE's own account put the follow-up cutting at several more weeks before the site was clear. A structure the size of Bagger 260, with a comparable amount of steel to work through, likely runs a similar clock, long enough that the news cycle has moved on completely before the last truckload of scrap leaves the ground. RWE hasn't published a piece-by-piece account of what happens to Bagger 260's own steel once it's down. That record, if it exists yet, isn't public. But the pattern at this exact mine, on the machines that came down before it, is documented and consistent. The steel gets sorted, separated from anything non-metallic, and sent for recycling rather than left on site as some kind of ruin. When Bagger 260's sister machine came down in 2020, the 7,000 tons of surviving scrap were explicitly earmarked for reuse. There's no reason to expect Bagger 260's own wreckage follows a different path. A working mine has no room for a permanent debris field, and scrap steel at this scale carries real value on its own. What that means, practically, is that the machine's actual disappearance, the point where there is nothing left of Bagger 260 to see, anywhere, in any form, happens quietly, weeks or months after the footage everyone watched stops being interesting. Nobody live streams a hydraulic shear cutting through the 200th section of collapsed girder. There's no countdown for it, no crowd, no clip. It's steady, unglamorous work, done by people whose names won't end up in any article about this, taking apart by hand what the explosives only ever laid on the ground for them. What's left, once all of that is finished, isn't a monument and isn't a scar. It's an empty stretch of ground on Hambach's first level, no different in appearance from any other patch of overburden the mine has already cleared and moved past, waiting for the next level's boundary to catch up to it. The work itself didn't disappear, it moved. The section of the first level that Bagger 260 used to handle now belongs to one of the mine's 240,000 class machines, the same upgrade RWE had already written into its plans 2 years before the blast. A bigger excavator doing more than double the daily work on the same ground. Nobody was left standing idle by that swap. The job got faster, with less equipment required to do it. Hambach's coal mining is still scheduled to stop entirely by the end of this decade, under the same statutory phase-out that has been quietly retiring this mine's equipment for years. Bagger 259 in 2020, the spreader that once crossed a motorway alongside Bagger 260 in 2025, Bagger 260 itself in 2026. These weren't isolated decisions so much as the same decision, made repeatedly on a schedule the company had filed with regulators years in advance. As the pit gets smaller, so does the fleet that works it, one machine at a time, until there's eventually no pit left to need any of them. Which brings the story back to where it started, not the blast, but the arithmetic underneath it. In 2004, RWE weighed the cost of taking Bagger 260 apart against the cost of moving it whole across 30 kilometers of open country, and disassembly lost. Millions of euros, 3 weeks of closed roads, a federal motorway shut down for the better part of a night, thousands of spectators bussed in to watch. All of it, by RWE's own accounting, cheaper than taking the machine apart. 22 years later, the same company looked at the same machine and reached the opposite answer, for reasons that had nothing to do with the machine failing and everything to do with what stood around it. Every neighbor in its class had already been retired. Every heavier machine at the mine could already do more than it could. There was no next assignment left to hand it, the way there always had been before. 6 machines still work Hambach's other levels today, and every one of them is bigger than Bagger 260 ever was. That isn't a coincidence of timing. It's the direction the fleet has been moving in for years. Fewer excavators, each one larger and more efficient than the last, doing the same overall job with less equipment and fewer crews required to run it. Bagger 260 wasn't defeated by that trend so much as caught by it, the way the smallest machine in a fleet that keeps trading up eventually always is. It was the last one standing that predated the upgrade, the final 110,000 class excavator on a site that had spent decades quietly moving past it, mine level by mine level, machine by machine. So this time, taking it apart wasn't the expensive option. It was the only one still open. The charges did the 60 seconds that made the headline, 4 months of stripping beforehand and months more of quiet cutting after, did the rest, the part nobody filmed, and the part that actually finished the job.